I wanted to start with the fact that you guys started Primary at 2015, $60 million fund. We just shared, and Abe will show this again later on, that we're in a sort of the market is bifurcated. There are people that are having really easy time fundraising, but actually most people are having the hardest time to fundraise ever. So a little bit kind of sharing of these dark times, and then also to Dick's point, what was the gap in the market for you to find like your right to win and convince people?
So I don't know if this is the hardest time ever, because if it's harder than it was for us in a process that started in late 2013 and didn't wrap up until the middle of 2015. So it was a 2-year process to raise the first fund. We got to a point at one point where we had to, set a date. Like, if it doesn't happen by X, we're done and we're going to go figure out what else to do. That date arrived. It hadn't happened, but we had that like little glimmer of hope. And as a founder and an entrepreneur, you're always just living off of the threads of hope that show up. But it was it was brutal. And like most things in success stories, it hinged off of one or two key people, and it hinged off a couple of relationships. And there was one family office that I still look back at that I think their investment was only $2 million in the fund, but it was that tipping point piece that kind of built some momentum, and everybody has to find those little things. But it was brutal.
Can you share just how long it took you to raise this?
It was 2 years.
2 years.
Yeah.
And just for context, both you and Ben were kind of successful investors prior to that and complementary to each other. And so maybe we switch gears to Fund 2 and then also kind of the right to win. And to use your words, so Vintage was the first institutional investor at Primary. Kudos to my partner Abe. But to your words, like, how did you guys tricked us and probably many others afterwards?
Well, so the right to win bit was when we started. Today we invest all over the place. We have actually several portfolio companies here in Israel now. But when we started, the vision in 2013 was that the New York City market was on the cusp of a Cambrian explosion of technology activity, that was an inevitable thing, and there wasn't anybody who had yet, certainly not in any definitive way, kind of claimed control and ownership in a leadership position in that market. And we just, largely to the credit of my partner Ben, who's a far bolder person than I am, he said, let's just say that's who we are. Let's just plant a flag and say we are going to be the leading seed investors in a market that's about to become the second most important technology market in the world. And so we limited ourselves for the first several years of the fund's life. We didn't invest almost anywhere else. We wrapped ourselves in a New York flag. We said that's who we are, and we set out to own the market. And doing that radically simplified the world for us. It gave us a believable story in the eyes of LPs. If we had started out from nothing and said, we're going to go invest in Silicon Valley and Tel Aviv and everywhere in between, nobody would have believed that. That would have been a complete bullshit story. Who the hell are you guys? But we defined the world small enough, we defined a battle we could win, and we won that. And part of what we did early on was, I think it was in 2016, our second year of activity, we had a founder who was building a really good company, and he went out to the Valley to raise a Series A. And he came back and he said, guys, I have a problem and you have a problem. Because all these people on Sand Hill Road are like, okay, like who are your seed investors? And I said Primary, and they said, who the hell is that? And they also said, you're in New York? That's kind of far away, and that's a pain in the ass, and I don't have any other companies in New York yet. And so we realized we had a brand problem and we had a New York credibility problem. And it's a little hard to imagine now, but in 2015, 2016, New York was not a place that most people were looking to invest. And so what did we do about that? We actually did something very much like this. We created an event that we set out to say, hey, we're going to create the defining event for the New York tech ecosystem. We're going to use it as a way to attract investors from the West Coast to show up. How do you get West Coast investors who don't believe that New York is credible to show up in New York for a New York tech industry conference? You call them up and you tell them you'll put them on stage, and they show up. And so we got like a few people to agree to come be on stage, and then we used them to get other people to be on stage, and then we used them to fill a room. And fast forward to today, we've now done this 9 times, and it's like a 3,000 person event now, and it is the defining event in New York, and that created a lot of halo for us as well.
I think before we kind of move on to the halo and the brand, there was another intentional decision that you made, and I think at least for us, when we looked at Fund 2, it was already kind of early on, and it just helping the founders and deciding that you want to build a platform that is greater than the two of you.
Yeah, so the reason that Ben and I had the mind meld that we had at the beginning was that he had been a founder, operating CEO, then turned angel investor. He was a very dissatisfied customer of venture capital as an asset class. I had spent a decade sitting in boardrooms and being in investment syndicates where I would say the success rate in terms of feeling like I had great partners around those board tables was about 20% maybe. And I was disappointed that most VCs showed up at board meetings, stated their opinions, and left, and
ate something in between,
and did next to nothing in between. Probably the most they did was throw like distracting introductions at the CEOs that they thought were helpful, but the CEOs, when you actually asked them, they didn't really want. And we thought, it was kind of absurd at the moment. And at the time this was going on, Andreessen was probably 5 years old and was building this, big platform of operating resources and strategic value stuff. But at Seed, the only people that we saw who were doing anything interesting, and they were doing things that were extremely interesting, was what Josh was doing with First Round. And so we looked at First Round and we looked at Andreessen and said, how do you, and we went more in the Andreessen vector towards like actual operating support resources that were kind of on our team that could engage with and support founders around particularly talent and customer development early on. Josh and First Round were playing a brilliant game around kind of a network strategy. But we just invested from the beginning a ton of most of our management fees in resources that were going to help these 2-3 person teams do the impossible thing that is go from 2 or 3 to 20 or 30. Fast forward to today, we're a 60 person team now. We'll probably be an 80 person team in another 2 years. We are like fully committed to putting our money where our mouth is on that support.
And we'll get to that. But I think when we're speaking about the brand halo, so most of the times when you go around and you meet someone like you with 10 years experience, or Ben, who was a founder and then a prolific angel, we talk to founders, other co-investors, and they said, Bread's fund, Ben's fund, like best case, it's like Bread and Ben's fund. But suddenly there was like this moment in time, I don't know if it was a moment or kind of gradual, there was like the primary halo, and kind of when was that? What kind of, and how did you expedite it to kind of make it more effective?
So I think there's a few pieces of that. One, the original like ethos of the place was to break out of this model where venture capital is a business practiced by, these like brilliant oracles who sprinkle amazing advice upon founders in desperate need of it. We thought that was just hubristic, absurd, but it was a narrative that carried much of the industry. And from the beginning, I felt like my job was to show up as the quarterback of a team of resources, a point guard of a team of resources that I was going to be bringing to the table to help people, so that when I was talking to a founder who was like, I need to hire a VP of engineering, it wasn't my job to help them hire a VP of engineering. It was my job to turn them to somebody on my team who could help them do that, or to get into brand X, Y, and Z who were the ICPs for them. It was to turn to somebody on my team. So the whole ethos of the place from the beginning was not Brad was your partner. It was the firm was the partner. I was a leader of a cavalry of resources, and so that did something to kind of change that. We probably were a little lucky in that our early successes, like our first fund is one of the better funds of that 2015 vintage, but it is not populated by a bunch of names that you all know off the top of your head. So there was a little bit of like luck in that we weren't actually investors in, a Twitter or a Facebook or something like that, where the name and the face of that investor tends to be like get into the news. And then we had a period in 21, I think it was, 2020, 21, where there were, I think it was 7 quarters in a row where we had companies that got to the point where, they raised billion-dollar valuation financings and were on the big board, the NASDAQ board in Times Square. And those successes were actually perfectly evenly distributed between me and Ben. And that's just luck as well. But the place never leaned one way or the other. And so that made it easier for the brand to really be primary. Yeah.
Cool. I think, and as you said, like initially your right to win both LPs and founders was like simplifying the value proposition. We do New York, and we do this very early, and we're going to own it. And then there was this moment of, I guess, partially because of these 7 quarters that you just mentioned, and then you decided to go more global. What made you make the decision, and also kind of like, how did you build Primary for that?
So we made a decision at the beginning of the firm that and everybody makes this decision at some point, consciously or unconsciously. We decided to make it at the beginning, that we wanted to build a firm that we would retire from, something that would definitively outlast us. And part of investing in that level of resource is the realization that if you don't do that, if you don't build some infrastructure and some systems and a way of being, you have no chance of doing that. And then as we started to have success and earn the right to scale a bit, we do think that, you would never raise a fund of funds that is built only around 2 or 3 funds. I think to run a venture capital firm that's built only around 2 investors is a similarly dangerous move. There's some benefit of portfolio diversification, whether it be in your fund of funds or in my firm, and we thought we would be better by expanding the partnership at some level. We didn't know how much right at the beginning, but we also had some really talented people who we had hired and we were developing, and they were kind of knocking on the door, and they needed to either get a seat at the table and a checkbook to start making their own investments from, or they were going to leave. And in fact, we had one early on who did leave. And so we wanted to grow the partnership, and as we started to grow the partnership, and simultaneously, this is probably 2019, the world was getting radically more competitive. Like certainly New York was no longer a secret in 2019. And every battle we fought was harder and harder than the ones we had fought in the first few years. And when I looked around at the market and thought, who am I afraid of? One of the things I was most afraid of was that there had been a real blossoming of these very niche sector-focused, highly networked in those sectors, highly expert, prepared mind type micro funds. And I was like, man, if I'm trying to win a fintech company against somebody who is all they do all day long is fintech, that's harder than competing against a generalist. Even though I had done, I had 2 fintech infrastructure unicorns in the first fund that I had done, that was just a hard battle. And so as we started to scale, we made a decision that we were going to become very specialized at the level of the individual investor. So now we've got, my partner Sam, who does nothing but healthcare all day long. My partner Emily does nothing but financial services all day long. My partner Tobias, who is here today, who does nothing but cybersecurity and is spending a lot of time in this market, obviously. And so we thought that at the intersection of a set of resources at the platform level around talent acquisition, customer development, long-term financing support, and then a set of individual investors who showed up with a deeply prepared mind, a set of networks, resources in those markets, that would be pretty hard to beat. And it turns out it has been pretty hard to beat. But then when I say to Tobias, okay, what is Tobias's job? Tobias's job is to be one of the 2 or 3 best cybersecurity seed investors in the world. Like, that's definition of success for him. If I were to say, and you have to do that while staying in New York City, that's impossible.
Yeah,
so we had to start. Yeah. We earned the right to start stretching too, because with that prepared mind, we earned the right to start winning in other places.
And I want to get to 2 more questions. So now you have a good problem that you have a few Tobiases. They're already sort of obviously early on, but most of them already did some very successful investments. How do you manage this, and how do you scale or not scale this internally? And let's leave succession for the end.
Yeah. So we have grown mostly internally. We made one great external hire into the partnership. Emily Mann was kind of starting to knock on the door to be a partner at Redpoint, and she joined us to lead fintech and financial services for us. But it's mostly grown from within. We operate differently than most venture firms. We've looked into importing more talent over time, and it's just been a little bit culturally hard. But these things are so trust-based too, and it's just far, far easier for me to trust somebody who I've watched work and develop over the course of 3, 4, 5 years than it is to trust somebody who you've gotten to know over the course of 6 months and a handful of dinners. The thing that we've done that I think you have to do is you have to give people the checkbook and the room to go before you're certain they're ready. And you have to be willing to support them when they fail. I don't think you can get good at this business until you've lost a reasonable amount of money. We always talk about pattern recognition as like the pattern recognition on the things that went well. Pattern recognition on the things that go poorly is at least as important. Pattern recognition around who are the founders, like Dick was talking about, where it's like, oh my God, I fell in love with the charisma and I didn't understand like the underlying grit and resilience. Like when you make bad decisions like that, that is pattern recognition of its own. And I can't just preach and teach that. I have to let you go and do it. And I'm sitting here with an LP talking about celebrating losing money, but like you guys understand that, right?
I actually think we do. It's not just do we understand, we encourage that because I think we feel similarly to you. And especially in the very early stage, otherwise you're not going to make the right calls.
Yeah, and if you put too much pressure on somebody to not lose, then they're not going to take
the risk,
the big swings. And you can only, the best venture deals are the ones that were most likely to fail. The most valuable company in our portfolio company right now is a semiconductor chip company that was started by 2 Harvard sophomores who were about to drop out to start an ASIC business. That's an absurd proposition, an utterly absurd proposition that was almost certain to lose, that now 2.5 years later has $1.25 billion of pre-orders before they've even shipped we were definitely going to lose all our money on that deal. We may still. But if we didn't take the swing.
Hope not. All right. We're running out of time, but I do want to say something because I think kind of the the thread across the conversation is that you guys have been really intentional almost in every step of the way. Obviously, it has to do with a lot of luck, but also with the fact that you were resilient and very intentional. And maybe shortly about like you're in your early 50s, like Ben is. You obviously you look like 30 and all of that, right?
28.
Yeah, exactly. But I know you start thinking about like the next phase of primary. So what's on your mind like in 30 seconds?
I'm not going anywhere soon, but I know, and this is a thing that I've talked to Alan about a little bit, and we're going to talk more about, if I don't start thinking about who's going to run the firm 10 years from now, you know, at least 6, 7 years in advance of that, it's going to be too late. Like, you have to be thoughtful and intentional. And so we're already, I mean, the vast majority of the economics of the firm, like the vast majority of the economics of the firm are in other people's hands other than Ben's and mine now. Ben has worked his way out of like all day-to-day decision making, because if the two of us are just in there doing everything, that just doesn't give anybody else the ability to have empowerment and frankly to make mistakes internal to the firm too. Like, we have to, and we've always celebrated internally, we run the business like an operating company, and for everything operationally that's worked really well for us, I could point you to 5 things that we've spun up and shut down because they didn't work. So we are actively divesting ourselves of decision-making power, day-to-day operational control, and trying to put ourselves in a situation as soon as possible such that if we got hit by a bus, you know, you guys would have an easy time making the next decision on our next fund, which would be yes, because you would look at an underlying set of people that you trusted. And so I think if you're not doing that work 6, 8, 10 years in advance of thinking you may want to actualize it, you're too late. And I've talked to a bunch of GPs and a bunch of LPs who have said the people who screw up building enduring platforms and generational transitions are the people who do it when it's like, oh, I want to retire next year.
Or you have to retire next year.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right.
Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you.